Haribo, anyone there?
Ghanashyam Baba.
Haribo, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Good to see you.
I can't hear you. Let me see if it's with something with me. Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Helmet. I can hear you.
You can
Hare
hear
Krishna.
me?
Hare Krishna. I can hear you, Ghanashyam.
All right, great.
Ghanashyam Prabhu.
Jai.
Hey,
Prabhu.
Badadaj.
It's good to see you. I just want to let you know we're going to watch for the first hour and then we have to go. So please forgive us.
All good. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Everything working out okay down there so far?
Yeah, things are going pretty well.
Glad to
Krishna's
hear.
grace.
Okay. Oh, and congratulations on the job. Akanta Bhakti's reminding me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel I'm shocked actually that it worked out so smoothly.
Well, we're not shocked. We knew that you would get something right away. We're just happy that it has happened. And, you know.
Thank you so much. Krishna's grace.
Very well.
Ananda Bihari, are you at Tompkins Square Park?
Yeah, I'm watching Gaurangi.
God.
That's my weekend job. That's what I do.
It's a nice place to be for the weekend.
Yeah. Congratulations on the job, Ghanashyam. I knew you were gonna get it.
Thank you.
You're qualified, and it's pleasing to Krishna, I feel.
I appreciate it. I'm totally surprised, but I'm grateful.
Nice.
All right. Well, I think we'll start.
Okay, I'm gonna stop my video.
Okay.
I'm running out of gas here, so I'll be listening.
So we're doing the 5th canto, 10th chapter, and feel free, anyone who wants to just interrupt and, with a question or a comment, please, you have full permission to just interrupt at any time, because I may not be able to see or hear anyone if I'm speaking somehow distracted or whatever it may be. So just jump in there. You have full permission to do so. Please do so. So here's the section we're doing. This is 5th canto, 10th chapter. And this is called The Discussion Between Jad Bharat and Maharaj Rahugana. If you're able to get this on your phone or computer as well, this section from the database, it'll probably be easier to follow that way, because I have a couple things open and it may be more difficult. So I encourage you to check out this section. 5th canto, 10th chapter, verses 1 through 13. And it's called The Discussion Between Jad Bharat and Maharaj Rahugana. And I'm going to read the short summary that Prabhupada gives at the beginning of this chapter. So I'll just start off with some prayers and then we'll begin. And I encourage you guys just to speak up, unmute yourself, share something, question, comment. I don't want to just speak for, an hour straight. Definitely want you to participate and share your thoughts. So just do some chanting for a moment and then we'll begin. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. 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 Om Gyantimarandasya Yananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Vidati Svabhavantikam. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Scha. He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinobandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanjana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadada Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Nice to see some of your faces and some of your names. So grateful to be with you this morning, studying Srimad Bhagavatam. And I was just mentioning before the prayers, please just interrupt when you need to. Unmute yourself, comment, question, just say my name, Ghanashyam, if I'm just lost in speaking. And because I definitely want it to be participation, comments from all of you. And I don't want to just speak, go on and on. But hopefully we can have a nice discussion together. You can hear okay? All right. So if you could also get this from the database, this section up, that would be probably really good. This is 5th canto, 10th chapter, verses 1 through 13. That's what we're going to try to cover today. It's called The Discussion Between Jad Bharat and Maharaj Rahugana. And this I found to be a really insightful conversation. Because I think what's nice to keep in mind when we hear this conversation, it's not just two historical personalities having a conversation and we listen to it and just kind of appreciate different things that are said, but it's actually a meeting, an encounter between material consciousness and spiritual consciousness. And we see how the interaction takes place. So this is a way of seeing through principles. Different historical personalities also embody principles. Just like, in Krishna consciousness, we talk about the Pancha Tattva. What does that mean? There are 5 beings, 5 personalities, but Tattva means principle also. So 5 principles are represented through those persons. So this is a nice way to read Bhagavatam because it makes it, much more relevant for us in a certain sense. So we're not just hearing about old persons and stories, but we're understanding principles that are interacting. So Maharaj Rahugana represents materialistic consciousness, and Jad Bharat represents spiritual consciousness. And then at first there's a clash between them, and there's some misunderstanding. But the glory of Maharaj Rahugana, this materialistic consciousness, it begins to recognize the superiority of spiritual consciousness. And then he humbles himself and becomes eager to learn. So this is a way of seeing through principles. Persons also embody certain principles. And so when we hear a story with different personalities, we can understand this is an interaction of different spiritual or material forces or energies. And you see why that's so significant for us, because I'm under material consciousness. But if I hear from somebody who's under spiritual consciousness, how do I interact and how do I receive that? That's what's highlighted in the story. Because at first Maharaj Rahugana, he doesn't understand it, and he actually becomes angry. But then he humbles himself and becomes eager to learn. What is this spiritual consciousness? It's a mystery for him at first. So I'm going to look at the short summary. Again, for those who just joined, 5th canto, 10th chapter. And Prabhupada starts many chapters of the Bhagavatam with a short summary. So I just want to read this together with all of you, if you can follow along. So in this chapter, Bharat Maharaj, now Jad Bharat, was successfully accepted by King Rahugana. So just that, right? King Rahugana successfully accepted. He successfully recognized the superiority of Jad Bharat's words compared to his own. He was successful. The king forced Jad Bharat to carry his palanquin and chastised him because he did not carry it properly. A carrier of King Rahugana's palanquin was needed, and to fulfill this need, the chief carriers found Jad Bharat as the most likely person to do the work. So they kind of misunderstood that the carriers of the palanquin of King Rahugana, they needed another carrier. And they saw Jad Bharat standing there. And they mistook his nature because he appeared very stout and strong and young. And they thought this is he's perfect for the work needed. All we need is someone to carry this palanquin. But they misunderstood his nature because actually he was very deeply sensitive, very elevated, self-realized soul. They just saw a strong body. Let's get him and have him help. But he was this very enlightened, sensitive being actually. And so again, there was a clash between this elevated, sensitive, spiritual consciousness and then the carriers of the palanquin who just wanted a man to do the work that they needed. And there's a misunderstanding. There's a disharmony. So Jad Bharat was therefore forced to carry the palanquin. Jad Bharat, however, did not protest this proud order, but humbly accepted the job and carried the palanquin. So he was grabbed by these carriers and he said, okay, I'll do some service if that's what's needed. And so he just agreed. He didn't protest. While carrying it, however, he was very careful to see that he did not step on an ant. And whenever he saw one, he would stop until the ant had passed. Because of this, he could not keep pace with the other carriers. The king within the palanquin became very disturbed and chastised Jad Bharat with filthy language. But Jad Bharat, being completely freed from the bodily conception, did not protest. He proceeded carrying the palanquin. When he continued as before, the king threatened him with punishment, and being threatened by the king, Jad Bharat began to talk. So the King Rahugana became angry because Jad Bharat was carrying the palanquin, but he was avoiding stepping on ants. And so while he was walking, the palanquin was shifting and it jolted somewhat because of his avoiding killing these little ants that were on the ground. And the other carriers were thinking, what are you doing? We have this job to perform. And the king at first was sarcastic, but then he became angry and he began to chastise Jedbart. And then Jedbart began to speak. And that's when his position as a self-realized soul was revealed through his words. So it says, I'm reading, by the way, for those who just joined, the short summary at the beginning of 5th Canto, Chapter 10. So Jedbart protested against the filthy language used by the king when the king chastised him. And the king, hearing the instructions of Jedbart, was awakened to his real knowledge. I think that word also is very significant, awakened to real knowledge. Real knowledge is awakened from within. It's not something from the outside that we just try to bring into our minds and memorize. It's not just information that we gather, but something takes place inside of us. It feels like an awakening of the truth that we always knew, but we forgot. So this is how we know, is the knowledge actually real that I have? Or is it some temporary information that may be necessary in life, but that kind of information is never liberating. It doesn't free the soul, but knowledge that's awakened, realization that comes from within, is actually benefiting you eternally. So I think this term, the way it's put here, when Jedbart began to speak, the king, hearing the instructions of Jedbart, was awakened to his real knowledge. When he came to his consciousness, he understood that he had offended a great, learned, and saintly person. At that time, he very humbly and respectfully prayed to Jedbart. He now wanted to understand the deep meaning of the philosophical words used by Jedbart, and with great sincerity, he begged his pardon. He admitted that if one offends the lotus feet of a pure devotee, he is certainly punished by the trident of Lord Shiva. So that is the summary in the beginning of this chapter by Prabhupada, and it gives us the context of the story. And there's a lot there. And now we'll look at some of the key verses in these beginning verses of this 10th chapter. Anything from anyone would like to share something just on reading that little summary, or any thoughts or significant points that you caught before I read the first verse? Just check in for a moment. And again, I mentioned earlier, anytime, just unmute yourself if you'd like to share something or say something. Okay.
Haribol, Ghanashyam Prabhu.
Haribol Prabhu, thank you.
Well, just wanted to say that I know, I imagine you're going to unpack this, but I'm really intrigued by this concept of this conversation being kind of like not just a conversation between two people, but a conversation between two paradigms. And I guess for me, sometimes, just when you said that, I hadn't thought of it that way, but when you said that, it made me, or my mind just started jumping to other like similar encounters in the Bhagavatam that sometimes can actually even be a little bewildering, because it can seem like sometimes very sort of extremes, like extreme views come out in those conversations. And I have to admit, sometimes the more devotional side of it doesn't always resonate with me as much as the other. So like in this conversation, I don't know, I may have like a little bit more sympathies towards the Maharaj Rahugana position in some ways, if I'm being honest. But it's helpful to think about it more in that sense of like the Bhagavatam is like really showing us two kind of paradigms. So I just wanted to appreciate that way of looking at it is something that I'm really excited about and intrigued by.
Yeah, I'm glad you caught that and spoke about that, because it's really been powerful for me to see things in that way when I'm hearing conversations, and because it brings it to us right now, because usually it is a conversation between material consciousness and spiritual consciousness. And by seeing it as like principles or energies interacting, then we also learn what I have to do, being under material consciousness, to be able to grasp and understand this other level that I'm not so familiar with, but somehow touches me. And that's what happens with King Rahugana. At first, he's rude, he's sarcastic, he's angry, but when he hears the words, he knows something is superior here. And then he humbles himself. And so this story comes alive for us in the here and now when you can see principles interacting, because those principles are always true. And this helps us from just seeing an old story. You know, when the Bhagavad Gita says, Tattvadarshi, one should approach the Tattvadarshi. Again, Tattva means principle, and Darshi is one who sees through principles. So they see the world through principles. They're seeing energies interacting. They're seeing Maya, the energy of Maya influencing a person. They're seeing the spiritual energy that's also there, but most people can't connect to it. So they have a vision of not just, getting caught up in people interacting and different, we'll see Jed Bharat is untouched by all the criticism because he simply sees Maya is possessing King Rahugana and he doesn't take offense. He sees the principles that are operating in the world. So when we can start to see through principles, then it's a whole nother vision of life. And it also teaches us, prepares us how to come under the spiritual energy. So I'm glad you got into it a little bit, because this has been really powerful for me to understand. As I mentioned, the Pancha Tattva, right? These are persons, but they all embody certain principles, like Srivas Thakur, of the Pancha Tattva. He represents the pure devotee, the Bhakti Shakti. So to understand what that means, and he's the embodiment of that principle. And then looking at his interactions from that angle gives us deeper insights. So anyone else want to just, on that point, before we just move on?
I was just going to share everyone.
Haribo Prabhu, I can't hear you well. I don't know if anybody else is hearing the same thing, but I'm hearing some static.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yep.
I think my headphones are a little messed up, but I was just going to share that I really like what stood out to me in just what you just mentioned in the intro paragraph is that sort of like this idea that we also can, Maharaj Rahugana, I believe, making them needing someone to carry the palanquin, and sort of like just finding someone, like you're saying, kind of how we do, where we make snap judgments of people and what they can do, what their capabilities are, and according to what we think that they can do, so he was strong-bodied and etc. But people being so much deeper than what we might, think they are in terms of our judgments. And this is a great example where he's so much deeper, and like you said, very sensitive and spiritually elevated. And so it's a principle also I was taking away, that we shouldn't, we should be mindful to look at people for who they are, and versus imposing our view on them, but then being open to it if we're given new information, like the king was.
It's a great point. Yeah, immediately the king just judges. Everyone judges Jed Bharat, seeing his body, seeing, he was like also kind of a bit of an avaduta, just walking around, practically nothing on, seemed very dumb, but actually he was on this very elevated platform. He was just detached and didn't want to get involved at all in the material energy of the material world. But they mistook him, they misunderstood him. So it's a lesson for us also to be aware of coming to some quick judgment of another person.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to start the reading of the text. That was the summary. And so as Prabhupada mentioned, the king's palanquin carriers needed another carrier. And seeing Jed Bharat there, they thought, perfect, this is the man. He's young, he's strong. He's got, Prabhupada says, firm limbs, so he can carry the palanquin. But actually, he was totally unfit for this kind of work because he was a very pure, sensitive Brahmana. And but he was forced to do it, and he didn't resist, which is interesting. He just kind of went along with it. Okay, you need me, what can I do? And he actually maintains that attitude even after speaking. He just says, well, this is the real truth of what's going on. But still, if you want me to carry the palanquin, I'll do that. So let's look at text 2. I just gave a little summary of the text 1. Text 2, we'll read, look at the English translation here. So again, 5th canto, 10th chapter, text 2. And I'll read this, and again, we'll feel free to comment and share. So the palanquin, however, was very erratically carried by Jed Bharat due to his sense of non-violence. Okay, so now we're getting a little glimpse into the consciousness. Okay, I'll do the work, I'll carry this palanquin. But he was in a state of non-violence. So what did that mean? As he stepped forward, he checked before him every 3 feet to see whether he was about to step on ants. Consequently, he could not keep pace with the other carriers. Due to this, the palanquin was shaking, and King Rahugana immediately asked the carriers, "Why are you carrying this palanquin unevenly? Better carry it properly." Okay, so this is what happens. Again, we're seeing 2 platforms here, right? Do this work. We gotta carry the king. This is our job. But Jed Bharat's kind of is in his own world of ahimsa, of non-violence. So he'll carry the palanquin, but he's looking ahead 3 feet. Where are the ants? I don't want to unnecessarily kill even an ant. You know, it's in Jainism also. Jains may be the strictest vegetarians of anyone. They have very high principles for non-violence. It's kind of their, like we have Pado Dharma. What is the Pado Dharma in the Bhagavatam? It's anything that helps us lead to pure loving service. That's what we call the supreme Dharma. The Jains have a saying that Pado Dharma is ahimsa. Their supreme duty or Dharma, they identify as ahimsa, non-violence to all living beings. And so if you see Jain monks, even today in India, sometimes they carry a broom when they walk, so they can sweep away any insects before they step. Some people may think that's very extreme. They also wear masks. You know, we're all wearing masks now because of the pandemic. The Jain monks also wear masks all the time because they don't want to breathe in some insects, breathe in some little tiny mosquito, whatever it may be. They don't want to commit any unnecessary violence. And so they cover their faces, they carry a broom. So Jed Bharat also is in a state of consciousness of ahimsa. And therefore he doesn't mind so much the shaking palanquin and the king getting upset. He'd rather do that than kill an ant. I remember I was in Mayapur once at the samadhi of and home of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Godrum Dweep. And I was there in the little courtyard and hearing a class. And you know, the reason why the Holy Dham is so powerful, it kind of heightens our own sensitivity. When you're in the Holy Dham, everything has meaning. Have you noticed that? When you're in a very surcharged spiritual place, you're seeing everything as meaningful. You know, something happens to you, somebody like, you know, chastises you, or something happens with some encounter with a Brajavasi or something, and you're seeing it like, what's Krishna doing here? I'm not like that in New York City. You know, I just get into my own. But when you're in a holy place, somehow your sensitivity increases. Actually, we should always live like that. We should always see, what is Krishna doing here with this encounter? Why did this happen in my life just now? Why did this little thing just happen? We want to always live in that consciousness, but it's much easier in a holy place. So anyway, I was hearing a class at Godrum Dweep, and there was mosquitoes, and one mosquito just landed on my shirt. And I just tried to swipe it off, but I ended up killing it, you know? And I remember, you know, I would never even think about this before. But I looked down at my shirt and realized I killed it by trying to swipe it. And I was totally like shocked and disturbed that I'm in this holy place and I'm hearing about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, his home, you know, and his samadhi. And I felt this deep like regret and like a kind of repentance actually, that I was saying, oh my God, Krishna, I just accidentally killed this mosquito on my shirt. And I remember I was just looking at it and I was thinking, who am I, you know, to just, you know, I'm disturbed and I'm just swiping and who am I to actually kill this other living? All these thoughts were coming. I was just in a sensitive place, you know, being in a holy place. And I felt awful about it. And it kind of changed me the rest of my, you know, for the rest of my life, in a sense, just being a little more aware, a little more careful, not to just like, you know, I was a little careless and I kind of strongly and I killed this little insect. And so I'm often not in that state, but we can see Judd Bharat lives in that state. And so while he's carrying this palanquin, he's very careful to not step on any ants. It's nice, right? The holy Dham has that effect on us. Have you ever noticed that? You know, you're seeing things very meaningfully. Everything that happens, you're just like in this different state of, oh, what's Krishna doing here? You know, why did this just happen to me? You know, you can deal with somebody at the market selling vegetables and see it in some spiritual way. I remember some little kid also approached me, in Radhakund, and he just like, I was trying to find there also, I was trying to find the Bhajan Kutir, the place where Bhaktivinoda Thakur had his bhajan at Radhakund. It's a little tricky to find. And I had to leave soon, so I just approached people and I was saying, because I didn't speak the language, I would just say, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Bhajan Kutir, like, where is it? Direct me. I was just approaching people and saying that, because I had a limited time there. And I was getting ready to leave in 15 minutes, but I wanted to see this place and I couldn't find it. So this little boy heard me, and he just came and grabbed my hand and just started pulling me. And he pulled me through this little tiny alleyway. And then some other man stepped in and tried to stop me. And he wanted some like money or something. And he was just stopping me. He was like blocking the entrance. And this was all happening. I'm like, man, I'm like in a pastime here. You know, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm just going to be humble and surrender. Maybe this kid wants to take me, but this man wants to stop me. And then the kid just like pushed the man and pulled me through and just kept running. And I just was running with him. And then he took me to this little corner spot and he just pointed up and he said, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Bhajan Kutir. And I just like fell and offered my obeisances and spent a few minutes there praying. And yeah, but just, you know, that whole encounter, I'm like, I felt like I was in some pastime, you know, and somehow there was some resistance, but this little boy was so sweet and helpful. And so anyway, things like that happen, right? In a spiritual place. Anyone have an experience of maybe something we normally take as a mundane encounter, but because it was in a spiritual place, it really just led to all kinds of realizations? Or anyone have something they'd like to share in that regard?
Hare Krishna.
Vivo, Yaranashi.
This is not such an amazing thing. It's a very little thing, but you made me think of it, so I figured I would share it.
Please.
I'm in Vrindavan with Jaini Tai Prabhu. I don't know if many of you remember him. And he lost this hat that he had, and he was a little attached to the hat. So he was trying not to be attached to it, you know. He was talking a lot about it. We're walking down the street. You know, I mean, I haven't been there in a long time, but there was an internet place very close to the temple. I think maybe right across the street or something. And we were kind of near there, and he's really lamenting about the hat. And so I asked him, I was like, well, where have you been? And he mentioned a couple of places. And I said, well, weren't you online before? And he said, yeah. I really don't think I left it there because I have this memory of having it after that. I said, why don't you check? And he was, no, but then he stopped himself and he said, you know what? Krishna speaks through his devotees. Let me check. And he goes upstairs and he finds the hat. And he comes back down and he's all happy with the hat. So it must be the power of the Holy Dham. Even something small and materialistic, you could even say, like that. You can find an example.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I think your example also shows that the holy place is also the association of devotees. When we're around devotees, we think this way. We think this way a little bit more than if we're just alone. And we can help each other. The devotee is the walking holy place, it says in Bhagavatam. And so by being around each other, this is why it's essential. We'll start to think more in a more of a Krishna conscious way, and we'll start to see meaning everywhere.
It's
This is,
interesting. So
yeah.
yeah. So if I have that thought, I can easily dismiss it. No, it's not going to be there. I remember having it after that. Keep going. But if you tell me something, then I could say like, okay, what is, like you said, what is Krishna trying to tell me here? I could check. Maybe he's not telling me anything, but maybe he is. So it's a good point. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I want to read a little of the purport to text too, because it's really good. Let's take a look at the purport. So this is 5th canto, 10th chapter, text 2. And we just heard how Chad Bharat has been pulled into this service of carrying a palanquin of a king. And he agreed to do it, but he's not stepping on the ants as he's carrying the palanquin. And this is causing a problem because the palanquin is shaking and the king is about to get very upset. So purport. Although Jed Bharat was forced to carry the palanquin, he did not give up his sympathetic feelings toward the poor ants passing on the road. A devotee of the Lord does not forget his devotional service and other favorable activities, even when he is in a most distressful condition. Jed Bharat was a qualified Brahmana, highly elevated in spiritual knowledge, yet he was forced to carry the palanquin. He did not mind this, but while walking on the road, he could not forget his duty to avoid killing even an ant. A Vaishnava is never envious or unnecessarily violent. There were many ants on the path, but Jed Bharat took care by looking ahead 3 feet. When the ants were no longer in his way, he would place his foot on the ground. A Vaishnava is always very kind at heart to all living entities. In his Sankhya Yoga, Lord Kapiladev explains, Suddha Sarvadehinam, living entities assume different bodily forms. And this is an important statement here by Prabhupada that I marked as just very significant. Those who are not Vaishnavas consider only human society worthy of their sympathy, but Krishna claims to be the supreme father of all life forms. Consequently, the Vaishnava takes care not to annihilate untimely or unnecessarily any life form. So most people have sympathetic feelings and compassion in our world, in this world. Often it's just directed towards human beings. It's a kind of partial compassion. But a devotee of the Lord who really has the realization that Krishna, that God, is the supreme father and creator of all living beings, then their compassion becomes whole and complete. In every living being they see that this is an object of compassion, and I have to have compassion under every circumstance. And we do our best because in this world by nature is kind of violent, right? We do our best. Violence is just a characteristic of this material world. You know, cancer comes into the body. What is it? These cells are trying to destroy the body, these cancer cells. Even in the body, you know, you take a little microscopic view of what's happening inside, say, your fingertip, and you'll see a war is going on. There are little tiny microbes trying to kill other microbes. That's the very nature of this world. But a devotee being in a state of compassion is always in that state, looking at every person, every living being with the eye of compassion and the eye of service as well. How can I serve here? If we don't have that state of consciousness, then we have to pick and choose where to be compassionate. And that's always limited and partial. That's the point here, right? If we're not in a state of compassion, then we clumsily choose where to direct our compassion. It's kind of clumsy because we might think, well, I'm going to direct it here, but we're missing out on so many other people or animals or situations that also need compassion. So if you're not in a state of compassion, then you just have to make a choice. There's a lot to be compassionate about in this material world. You just have to make a choice. Where will I direct it? And that's all necessary and needed, but it shows the difference between two states of consciousness. You know, Prabhupada says, those who are not Vaishnavas consider only human society worthy of their sympathy. Right? So if we direct our compassion towards human beings, some people will say, where do you direct compassion for human beings? Well, you should focus on family. You know, you emphasize that. And somebody may say, well, yeah, family, that's important. But even more important is psychology. You focus on the workings of the mind and how to help people come to a healthy level of mind, right? And somebody else may say, well, that's nice. I think the real problem is food, actually. What food do human beings eat? If that gets focused on, then people will be in a better state. And somebody says, no, none of those things are the primary focus. It should be culture. The culture we grow up in, this is where we should put our focus. That will do the best for people. It goes on. But you see, what everybody's doing is just choosing their best idea of where to direct their compassion. You see how it's necessary, but there are flaws when you're just trying to kind of choose where to direct it. What to speak if you're in a state of compassion, where everywhere you actually see the right way to go and the right way to act. And you understand, well, all of that is important. All those places are important. But a devotee also ultimately sees that this is actually a spiritual issue. This inability to be compassionate and to see with the eye of compassion is ultimately a spiritual issue, and I'm going to focus on that primarily. And I care about the other things, and I do what's needed. But I also see the real truth that the primary issue is a spiritual issue, to live from the spirit. If I can do that myself and encourage others to do that, then we'll all be in a state of compassion, and then all problems are solved. They may still exist on the material level. People will always be fighting and there will always be strife. But at least within my own heart, I've resolved something very deep, and I can help others also do that. So this is the difference between partial compassion and a vision of compassion, which comes with a change of heart. Any thoughts on this point before we move forward? Comments, questions, disagreements?
Ghanashyam Prabhu, I have a question, or an observation and a question. In his previous life, we also saw an example of Bharat Maharaj kind of being in what appeared to be like a very deep place of compassion and directing that compassion towards a deer. And in that instance, that apparent compassion was like the cause of his downfall, so to speak. And here in this life, he's also in a state of what we might call like extreme compassion or something, radical compassion or something like that. But rather than being seen as his downfall, is here kind of glorified and almost like equated with his devotional service, right? Like in that purport, Srila Prabhupada seems to kind of associate his mood of compassion with being in a kind of a devotional state. So yeah, just wondering what you think about, like what can we understand as sort of the key difference or distinction between those two apparent displays of compassion?
That's a great point. And I'm glad you brought that up because, yeah, I kind of think the essence of your question is, what is that real compassion? Because he apparently was very compassionate in his previous life. He certainly was, as Bharat Maharaj. But that compassion towards the deer, that same sensitivity, right? Towards the deer and taking care of the deer was his downfall. And here it's being glorified as the state of a devotee. I have some thoughts on that. I want to first open up and see if anybody else has a thought on that. What is the difference? What is healthy spiritual compassion? And what is something that maybe looks like it, but isn't quite the real thing? And why is it not the real thing? Anyone have, before I respond, I also wanted to see if anyone has some thoughts on this. Great observation.
Hey, Bob.
Haribo.
So I was thinking, Bharat Maharaj's compassion was actually for himself, right? He became attached to the deer, so it was for himself, whereas Jadabhart's compassion was for the other. It was for those ants.
Why do you think Jed Bard's compassion to the deer was for himself? In one sense, it was a baby deer, it was in need, it was vulnerable, and he was taking care.
Yeah, no, not that. That initially, that was totally compassion, right? That was totally compassion for this other living entity. But it became twisted is too extreme. But it became about, right? His attachment was to be with that deer. Right? That wasn't compassion anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point.
See, I don't know. It eclipsed his initial compassion.
Yeah, good point. I mean, at some point you can hear, if you look at that story very carefully, that it was this, yeah, you're right, it was an attachment where he wanted this deer and he was brokenhearted because the deer would no longer be with him and what this was doing to his mind. It was like, there's a compassion in this material world that also clings to others. And that shows in and of itself that there's something very personal involved. I see this in the hospital, of course, working with people. When people pass away, I've always observed that the deepest kind of compassion is when you love a person and say they pass away. When you love a person, you have affection, you have gratitude, and you also now let them go. You also are able to let them go. And, that's real love, actually. Because there's also, we see in this world like a mother and father. It's so hard, right? You have to get attached, you have to protect, you have to serve. Can you also let that person be and let them go just a little bit? And maybe hopefully as they get older, a little bit more. And you let them be and you accept them for who they are and what they need to do, but always staying connected and attached in a healthy way, but also a letting go. And so that was lacking in Bharat Maharaj, but that's no longer lacking in Jed Bharat, as he's taken care to be very careful, but somehow there's this other part of it. And it's more pure, actually. Those are my thoughts. Anyone else on this subject? How do you feel? Anyone?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Elijah Sheila.
Haribo.
And Haribo. I don't have an answer about what is a healthy state of compassion, because since you've mentioned it and this partial versus a state of compassion, I was thinking about how I do have a sensitivity towards animals and children who many times don't have a voice. And my feeling on compassion is that it can just be sometimes overwhelming because there is so much going on. So that would be, I think, an unhealthy state of compassion, when you let it bring you to a point where you want to do something, but you're not in a position to do anything. And so it feels like I want to do something, but these animals or these children are in another country, and it can make one feel very unbalanced, and it's kind of a painful place to be. And so now, since you brought up a healthy state of compassion, I'm just kind of focusing on the overwhelm and an unhealthy state of compassion, I think. So if you could at some point address that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. You know why it's overwhelming for us? Because I'll say I'm under material consciousness, and I'm trying to have my material consciousness be in a state of spiritual consciousness, which is like total compassion to all living beings. But the material consciousness can't do that. You see, there's a deep transformation has to take place, a deep awakening of spiritual consciousness. If we try with our material consciousness, which is what we have and what I'm under presently, I can't force it to be compassionate to all living beings. And so we get overwhelmed. Like you said, where do we direct it? Okay, I'm doing this and that's nice, but so many people are suffering. And what about the people in this part of the world? And how do I do it? And we try to give because we have a good heart. We try to give to serving. But we're doing it in a state that actually is not capable. We're doing it in a material consciousness is not capable of total compassion. But Krishna consciousness means there is a possibility of coming under another energy, another state of consciousness called, this is the Daivi Shakti, the divine energy of the Lord. And when we somehow get right with Krishna and surrender to Krishna, then that state is ours. Now we're under another state, another energy. And from there, total compassion is simply a characteristic of spiritual consciousness. It's inherent in that consciousness. You know, Jed Bharat is not so much trying to be compassionate. He simply is compassionate. We're trying to be compassionate under a state of consciousness which is incapable of being totally compassionate. We can only be partially compassionate right now. And we do our best, and that's where we are. But so then what is the mindset of a devotee is that, well, this is where I am. I have to be a little humble here. I'll do my best and make intelligent choices of where I direct my compassion. But from within the heart, I'm also longing for this, that Krishna bless me so that I can actually see with the eyes of compassion, that my lens always is compassionate. I long for that. When I chant, I long for that state. At the same time, I humbly acknowledge that I'm not there. And if I try to do too much right now, I'll just overwhelm myself. But let me still do what's needed and what's necessary and do my best. So those are my thoughts on that. But
Thank you, Ghanashyam. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else on this before we move forward? There's, they always give a lot of verses for the Bhagavat Sravanam, and I don't get very far, so I apologize for that. But I think there's so much already that I'd rather that we're talking about something where we're all getting something rather than just covering a bunch of extra verses. So I'll stop one more time and ask if there's anything else before we move forward.
Ghanashyam, I sympathize with you because I've been there also, and I know we're only on whatever it is, verse 2 or 3, and but I just love so much your emphasis on this idea of a state of compassion as opposed to sort of very particularized, competing interests. And it reminds me, since you evoked Bhaktivinoda Thakur so much already, it very much reminds me of some of the things that Bhaktivinoda Thakur has written about compassion and this idea of a state of compassion, where I think it's in Chaitanya Shikshamrita, where he talks about, for a devotee, I'm paraphrasing, but a devotee's underlying consciousness is a consciousness of compassion, and then that devotee uses kind of their discernment in how that compassion manifests. Sometimes it manifests as caring, sometimes it manifests as a friendship, sometimes it manifests, even as he says, indifference to offenders. So if someone is being, as happens later in the story, when someone is being sort of offensive towards us, that compassion is still there, but it manifests in this way of maybe maintaining some distance. And it's just, I just think it's such a brilliant understanding of how it's the same compassion, it's just manifest in different ways. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of share that, and I think it very much resonates with your idea of this like state of compassion.
That's great, yeah, and just imagine how attractive is that to be in a state of compassion where you kind of know what to do in each of those circumstances, and it may differ and change, but because of a certain realization, you kind of, it's not like you're struggling to figure out, what does it mean here? But there's somehow you're guided from within by the Paramatma to actually understand what it means under this circumstance. And how attractive is that to be in that state, It's so true. I asked Radhanath Swami something like this once, like, what is real compassion? And he gave an interesting answer. He said, it's inconceivable. That was his answer. He's like, in other words, our minds can't even conceive what real compassion is. But like, because it may take different forms and we get confused. Compassion could be strong words to somebody at the right time, in the right moment, for the right reason. It could be very sensitive, encouraging words, no matter what the other person is doing. We have to do our best to discern. But there's also a way where the discernment is natural because of seeing really clearly what is the necessary thing to do under this circumstance. That's the very definition of realization. It's that the circumstances are changing, but I still know, because of the guidance from God within my own heart, what compassion means right here, right now. And so he answered me by just saying, it's inconceivable. He said, he called it an inconceivable force, compassion. Right? We just think it means being nice and, doing our best. That's what it means. And for us, and we have to do our best. And we should appreciate people who are going in that direction in this world, because this is where we're at. We're under a certain kind of consciousness and we have to do our best. But how attractive is this other state of consciousness, which is guided from within? Okay, text. Next text is 3.
Arbo Ghanashyam.
Yes, Prabhu.
This is Jagannath Pandit Das. How are you?
Jai, Prabhu, how are you? Please, please.
Great. I just had a comment to add also. I think it's so powerful because you're talking about being compassion always versus doing compassion in a particular instance. And so being in a conditioned state, we're trying to practice compassion, and that comes out often as doing compassion in different instances. But through our sadhana, through our chanting, through the purification process, we're trying to actually get to that state of being compassion. Because then we're not deciding, okay, yeah, this time I will be compassionate, this time I won't. This person triggered me, or I strongly disagree with this, so I won't give compassion. All those kind of things.
Yep.
But as we continue to go through the process, we can gradually purify to the point where we can always be compassionate. So then it's automatic, like you're saying. The one thing I was thinking also is that we were comparing Jad Bharat to his previous life and how he dealt with the deer versus now with this ant and the king. He's not seeing any difference between the ant and the king. Pandita Samadarshana, he's seeing them all equal. Now, if I try to put myself in that situation and I'm carrying the king, I probably wouldn't be thinking about, am I stepping on an ant? I'd be more concerned about what the king is going to do to me, how he's going to see this. I wouldn't be thinking so much about the ant. But that tells us the consciousness that Jad Bharat has at this particular time versus his last life. Incoming.
That's a great point. You're right. He's in a, we can't, Jad Bharat, we have to remember, like the context here is that he was Bharat Maharaj. He had a strong attachment to a deer. He became a deer. As a deer, he still had realization of what had just happened and why. So this next life as Jad Bharat, his mood is total detachment from everything worldly. So it's hard for us to a little bit relate to some of this, because we could even question as a devotee, and if I was doing some service from some important person in this world, even with the understanding of Krishna consciousness, would I prioritize an ant over that person? You might think, well, that doesn't even make sense being in spiritual consciousness to do something like that. So, but we have to remember his state is, he's in a very elevated, sensitive state of consciousness, which is very, in a sense, unique to him. So a devotee may still make distinctions and decide, okay, this is better than that, and this is where I place my compassion. But somehow he's in a state of consciousness where none of that, he just doesn't want to get involved at all in the material energy. And so the context for him is perhaps slightly different than our own context, or very different. But we should see how attractive this is and want it to manifest in our lives, maybe in a slightly different way, but we still want that state of consciousness. And then we still have to discern and figure out, you know, maybe how to use it. But so yeah, but this is so attractive, isn't it? That this is actually possible to, and like you said, instead of just choosing, you know, actions of compassion, rather the being of compassion. So thank you. Okay, so the text, text 3. When the palanquin carriers heard the threatening words of Maharaj Rahugana, they became very afraid of his punishment and began to speak to him as follows. So the other carriers, now they're doing their service to the king, and now they just, you know, employ Jad Bharat, and now they're getting worried because they're all carrying this palanquin together, and that they know they're going to get chastised by the king. And so it says they became very afraid of the king's punishment. And then how did they start to speak to Jad Bharat? They said, well, they told the king that this is not our fault. We just acquired this man, and he's the one who's walking in this strange, uneven way. So don't, you know, please understand what the situation is here. We're not just suddenly, not that we can't carry this, but it's this man that we just acquired. So they came up with the excuse and blamed Jad Bharat. And then in the next verse, King Rahugana says, then he directs his attention to Jad Bharat. And he speaks to him in a sarcastic way. He said, oh, my poor friend, is it that you're very fatigued? That was sarcastic because he just started carrying the palanquin. And he said, is it that you're very weak? That was also sarcastic because he was big and strong, actually. Oh, you know, you're weak, and oh, or is it that the other carriers are not cooperating with you? Also sarcastic because he was the problem, not the other carriers. So the king at first is kind of lighthearted a little bit, right? And he kind of is sarcastic, basically, but he's also saying, you know, get your act together. And then from sarcasm, he starts to get more angry. And look at text. Well, we'll look at text 7. We'll jump to text 7. What I just spoke were those verses in a kind of summary form. But basically, I'll read text 6, part of it. In this way, the king criticized Jad Bharat with sarcastic words. Yet despite being criticized in this way, Jad Bharat had no bodily conception of the situation. He knew that he was not the body, for he had attained his spiritual identity. He was neither fat, lean, nor thin, right? Because the king thought, oh, he's very strong, and these judgments were there if the other carriers thought the same. So he's like, I'm not fat, I'm not strong, I'm not weak, I'm not thin, I'm not lean. Nor had he anything to do with a lump of matter. That's the body, Prabhupada's referring to. A combination of the 5 gross and 3 subtle elements. He had nothing to do with the material body and its 2 hands and legs. In other words, he had completely realized his spiritual identity, Aham Brahmasmi. He was therefore unaffected by this sarcastic criticism from the king. Without saying anything, he continued carrying the palanquin as before. What I like here is that Jad Bharat was totally untouched by the words of King Rahugana. Isn't it amazing how somebody's words can affect us so much? I mean, if you think about it, it's just words, right? Somebody says some words, some little criticism comes to us throughout our day. And it can really just ruin our day, ruin our week. We keep playing it back in our minds. We start to build up a resentment towards the person. All just words. And it gets in there and affects us. Or somebody says very nice words, praises us. And we kind of feel better about ourselves. That's also a little trick of Maya, because if we accept that praise fully and get kind of excited about that, then we're also setting ourselves up that when criticism does come or when that praise is taken away, we'll also be deeply hurt, too hurt. You know, it's natural to feel something, but it also shows an identification. This person is just seeing my material identity and qualities and characteristics. But if I truly see that that's not me, then I'll be equal in both praise and criticism. Right? So Bhagavad Gita says this in the 14th chapter, that the quality of a self-realized soul is that they're equal in both praise and criticism. We appreciate the praise, we can accept it in a certain way, but we don't get unnecessarily puffed up by it. We also know, even a devotee is praising me and I know, well, they're seeing this quality in me, but I know myself pretty well. And I have this nature and that's good. I accept that encouragement from the devotee. But I also know, I'm just far away from where I need to be, and not like feeling guilty about it or anything, but just kind of being in touch with the reality and not just totally embracing that praise, taking it in, getting built up from it. But we humbly thank the devotees. We are encouraged. At the same time, we know something about ourselves that stays humble. We know that there's a kind of quality that's being appreciated, but at least I know for myself, people always, they'll appreciate me with something with being very peaceful. But I know myself pretty well, not completely, but I also know that peace that I'm always kind of trying to be in, it's also not the pure spiritual peace. It's a kind of, I stay peaceful by sometimes avoiding conflicts and avoiding confrontations that may even be important for me and necessary in my life. And so it's kind of like a form of peace which is not quite the real thing. And so I appreciate when devotees may say something, but I also I try not to allow it to get me proud or to be fooled that I'm actually in a state of spiritual peace. Some thoughts? Anyone have any thoughts on this? Like in terms of not being affected by praise or criticism? Because Jad Bharat gets criticized here, it just rolls right off. No effect. No anger towards the king. No hatred. He just sees it as words and lets it go and just keeps carrying the palanquin.
I mean, Prabhu, I would just add that what you said was spot on. That I was reading a quote recently that if we live by praise and we die by criticism, and like you just mentioned, that if sort of we become too attached to it, and sort of like where are we deriving our a sense of identity and confidence from? What's the basis of that? And I know for me, like you mentioned, if someone praises me, then I can get elevated, and then when there's criticism, you go right down, and it's constantly going back and forth. So definitely things are definitely a principle of staying like detached, like you mentioned, and even keel, and understanding where our source of confidence comes from, or identity.
Yeah. And actually, when you're in that state of consciousness that, someone, say a devotee encourages you with praise, then we accept it humbly and we thank that devotee. And in our hearts, we're thinking, Krishna, please let that quality actually manifest in my heart. And just being in that state of knowing I'm not truly there, but wanting to be there, that is where the confidence comes in. That is a confident state of consciousness because you're in reality.
Right.
You're not fooled in thinking that you are already in this spiritual state. And you're also not just like condemning yourself for being in a materialistic state. It's a perfect, nice in-between state to be. And that's where you'll get confidence, when you can admit that actually I don't have this pure quality, but I want it. And this is why I'm a devotee, and this is why I'm striving. This is why my life is directed in this way. Krishna, please let that real quality manifest. If you can remain in that consciousness, you will have confidence, and you will not be destroyed when someone criticizes you, and you won't get puffed up when someone praises you, because you're in reality for the time being where you are, which is sort of in between material and spiritual.
That actually reminds me of, I think I was listening to a class, I think it was Buddha Bhavana Prabhu, but he gave a definition of humility that you just mentioned, very similar to that, which is humility is about being truthful. So, you know, like if we have some skills, we all have gifts and talents and strengths. But often when we're in a state of ego, we're overblowing them. And then when we're like totally destroyed, we're sort of undervaluing them. But like you're saying, kind of being real with, okay, this is what I have and I can offer, but also this is where I'd like to be and I'm working toward, definitely is powerful paradigm shift.
Yeah, and you'll find yourself, if you remain in that state of acknowledging both the material reality and the spiritual reality, you will be confident. Confidence will start to come into your heart because you're in truth. Krishna has revealed something to you. Krishna has actually showed us this. It's not our power to be able to see that I'm in between material and spiritual content. It's the mercy of Krishna. And if we just feel grateful for seeing the truth, then I'm sort of in this in-between place. You know, we talk about chanting. There are 3 stages of chanting. There's the impure state, there's the clearing state, and there's the pure state. That's all. 3 kinds of chanting. Either impure chanting, and then there's an in-between, impure and pure, which is called the clearing stage. All devotional items are like that. Hearing can be impure, clearing, or pure. Service to the deities can be impure, clearing, or pure. And similarly, our state right now can be impure, clearing, which is starting to clear away the impurities, and then pure. So being in that clearing stage of life, Krishna has showed us that's where we are. But by his mercy, now we know something different. I'm just not fully identified with material consciousness, but I know there's a potential for something else, and I want to start to clear away what blocks me from that. Krishna shows me that light. Therefore, thank you, Krishna, for letting me see this truth. And all confidence will come from that state of consciousness.
I wanted to add that I'm finding this class particularly uplifting because it's hopeful. It's hopeful that we can learn more about this clearing state. And I would love to be at this point where nothing affected me at this point. But I have to say that my weak point is at my work situation. And it's such a roller coaster between sometimes praise and sometimes criticism. And it's such a difficult place to be. And if I could learn to be more have more equanimity, it would be such a healthier state of mind versus this roller coaster. Recently, somebody said to me, wow, I really noticed the difference between what you sounded like yesterday and what you sounded like today. And it really hit home the effect of things that are said and done to us. They really noticed it in my voice. So thank you for this teaching, and thank you for the hope. There's hope. There's hope for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. There's definitely a hope. You know, we just have to acknowledge where we're at. You know, that's the humble part of just acknowledging that, yeah, you know what, I'm not in the state I'd like to be, but I desire it, and I want to understand it. You see, King Rahugana, this is what's going to happen to him. When he hears Jed Bharat's words, something clicks in his mind that this is superior than the state that I'm in. And what does he do? He starts to become eager. He tells Jed Bharat, explain your words a little bit more, because I can't quite understand. You know? So anyone who becomes a devotee, all of us for here, somehow we heard pure spiritual teaching, and something in us recognized it and wants that level of consciousness. So that's beautiful. That is so much beyond the ordinary state of material consciousness, because at least we can now recognize that something else is possible. But let me still acknowledge where I am. That's okay. You have to go through this process. So where you're at, where you're struggling with this weakness and we're affected by words, this is totally normal. This is what has to happen for us to ultimately transcend it. We have to start to want something different. We have to start to not like the material consciousness, because it's always bringing us up and then shooting us down. That has to start to frustrate us in a healthy way, where we actually, yeah, why be happy about that? Well, you know, I'm up and I'm down and words are affecting me now. I'm so dependent on what other people think and say. We should start to feel that. Is anything else possible? And is there another possibility? And I don't want that anymore. How do I get, by Krishna's grace, how do I see another way of living? And that's beautiful. So just don't be too heavy on yourself and too guilty feeling and all that. That's another trick of Maya. To get devastated by guilt is another trick of Maya. We should just think that's what it is. That's where I am, but I'm on the path to clearing away. And therefore, I'm so grateful Krishna has given me this opportunity to be in this clearing stage.
Okay, I'm on the path. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ghanashyam Prabhu.
Ghanashyam, please, you had something?
Well, three brief things. One is from one nine to another. Thanks for your honesty about your peacefulness.
Yeah, the Enneagram 9 he's referring to.
The other thing is, you didn't spend much time on it, but when you mentioned that the other palanquin holders, they were saying like, it's him, it's this new guy, right? It made me think of in the first canto, Mother Earth as the cow is getting beaten, right? And King Parikshit said, who's done this to you? And he doesn't say. He says so many other things, but he doesn't say. And they were just so quick to go like him. You know? Whereas Kanta Bhakti said they were quick to throw him under the palanquin, you know. But
yeah, that again shows material consciousness can only see externally. You know, material consciousness means there's the person we can see, and they were right in a sense, right? It's him. But they're only seeing what's immediately in front of them. That is the mark of material consciousness. You have to just externally judge the situation.
Right.
But someone with spiritual consciousness, they say, okay, those bodies are doing that. His body's doing that. But what's actually behind that? Is there a principle at work, or maybe this you know? So when you have spiritual vision, you see a little bit more because you start to see subtle things. You start to see principles and energies and things like that. And you can understand why maybe some, again, how does that work for a devotee? When they see somebody doing something wrong, they don't say, it's them, but they see that somehow this personality, just like I have a problem of being influenced by Maya, by illusion, this pure soul has come under the influence of a material energy, which we call Maya. And the modes of nature are dominating this person, and therefore they're acting with hate, or they're acting with anger, or they're acting with criticism. One starts to see that the modes are operating and not just directly this person. Now this person has surrendered to the modes, so they're responsible also. But you know that, you know, we've all surrendered to the modes of nature in a certain way, and we're struggling with that. Some know it and some don't.
So lofty, man. I wish I could get there already. My third thing was I was talking to Gauravani one time about receiving praise, and he said something that I thought was beautiful, so I thought I would share it. He said, when people praise me, in my mind, you know, I say thank you and everything, but in my mind, he said, I transform those words into flower petals, and I offer them at the feet of my Guru Maharaj. And I thought that's a lovely way to deal with praise, at least, you know, as an offering, acknowledging that it's not me.
Beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful. Just to have that recognition of that's what's going on is by the grace of Krishna and Guru. And so we offer it back. We see Krishna is trying to encourage me through this devotee. And so we offer those flower petals back to Guru and Krishna. Thank you.
I told you at the beginning of class that we were going to have to leave at 12, but neither of us can really break away from your class. So.
Oh, well, I'm glad you stayed. Okay, I'm going to go a little further. We have just like 10 minutes left. I'm going to go a little further because now I'm going to jump a couple verses forward to the response of Jad Bharat. Now he's finally going to speak. And again, remember what we mentioned in the beginning, that this is not just an old historical encounter, but we're going to see this is an interaction a encounter between material consciousness represented by King Rahugana and spiritual consciousness represented by Jad Bharat. And when Jad Bharat now speaks and reveals his spiritual consciousness through words, King Rahugana recognizes, I'm sorry, yes, King Rahugana recognizes that this is superior to what I said. And he starts to humble himself. So let's go to text 9. One quick thing before I read text 9. This is a very philosophical section, but something that's helped me and I want to share is that Bhagavat philosophy is not philosophy as it's normally understood by people. We think philosophy means some idea or some concept, and I put it into my mind, I store it into my mind, and then I try to remember it at the right time and use it. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. You know, it's so, you can feel that, just feels so disconnected. It's like some idea out there, and I'm like trying to get it or use it, and I fail sometimes, and that's not quite the right understanding of this spiritual wisdom. The better understanding is that these words are not something to put into my mind and try to remember, but it's a power. The verses from the Bhagavatam, it's like coming under a power. And so the only thing to do is to be in a receptive state of consciousness where you can be touched by that power. And then you can have realization of what's being said. It's not intellectual, actually. It may have to be, again, for some time, being in a state where we're at. But there's also a way of just receiving the energy. Because the word for this spiritual knowledge, the words in Sanskrit is the Chit Shakti, which literally means knowledge potency or knowledge power. It's a power of God. It's just like, for example, a flower bud. You know, when the flower bud comes under the rays of the power of the sun, right? The rays of the sun are like a power, right? It's an energy. You feel warmth and it gives light. When the power bud is under that influence, then it will start to grow and change. So don't look at these verses as like some philosophical thing to like figure out. I mean, we're going to do that naturally. I did that for many, many years. But I think my understanding is changing a little bit, that to just hear and realize that these truths being spoken, again, it is a different sound vibration. And my only duty is to be in a receptive state of consciousness, which means faith, and gratitude, and humility. And then we can be changed by what's being said and not just store it in our minds. You know, when Bilva Mangala Thakur, you know, he was attached to a prostitute, the story of Bilva Mangala Thakur. And he was doing everything to get the association of this prostitute. And at some point, she saw how much he was going out of his way, and she just said a few words to him. She said, if you had this kind of determination to become a devotee of Krishna, you'd immediately become a pure devotee. So when he heard that, when Bilva Mangala Thakur heard those words, because they were truth, and somehow she had realization and she knew what she was saying, and it was pure sound vibration in a sense, because it was the absolute truth. When he heard that, it transformed him on the spot. It wasn't like a philosophical point that he had thought about and figured out and like considered it. It was like, bam, he woke up. And he said, that is it. That's all my life is meant for. I remember now. And even after that, he still had some struggle, but the way it hit him was he came under the influence of a statement of truth. So these verses are like that. Don't see it as some philosophical thing that just we have to get entangled with and try to figure out. That's how the world understands philosophy. But sound vibration, pure sound vibration, seeing as like the sun rays, it's an energy. And if I am in the right state, when I hear it, it can transform me. Haven't you had the experience of someone giving a class. And maybe the whole class, whatever, you were distracted and you thought it was an okay class. But someone else who heard it was like, wow, what a class, that transformed me. And you're kind of like, what? Why did it have that effect on you and not that effect on me? Or maybe we heard a class which was like normal to many other people, but for us, something was there that just lit up and changed us. Why does that happen? It's not because someone understood the philosophy better. It's because somebody had a receptivity in the moment and they were touched by it and they united to that truth. Something in them united to the truth that was spoken. So I bring that up now because it's going to get philosophical, but we have to have the right understanding of spiritual knowledge. It's a little bit different. It's a different energy. And if we're in the right, if we harmonize with that energy, then you will be changed by the words. And it's not just some interesting intellectual verse. So I built that up so much, and now it's like there's no time for the verses, but we'll look at one. Because they're more or less very similar, because he's making one point, Jad Bharat. And basically, what is that one point? Everything you're saying, King, everything that's coming from your mind, from your mouth, it's all on the level of my body and mind, but that's not me. So I take no offense. I'm not troubled. I'm not anxious. I'm not disturbed, because I know that I'm spirit. And then when the king hears that, he's like, wow, how do I understand this? How do I experience that? So I'm going to read one more verse, which is quite long, and then stop and open it up for final comments, thoughts, questions. So this is text 9. So just try to hear in a state of consciousness who just knows that in one sense these words are beyond us, but I'm grateful. Krishna has revealed this to us. Krishna has given us an opportunity. And think, how can I serve these words? And not just, the danger is to speculate, because that puts us as the master. You think about it, to speculate when you hear something, I'll figure it out. Let me see how I see it. And we kind of change it. We're kind of in control of it, rather than saying, this is beyond me, it's superior to me, let me take it in. Let these words change my heart. That's another way of reading and hearing. So the great Brahmana, Jad Bharat, said, my dear king and hero, whatever you have spoken sarcastically is certainly true. Actually, these are not simply words of chastisement, for the body is the carrier. The load carried by the body does not belong to me, for I am the spirit soul. There is no contradiction in your statements, because I am different from the body. I am not the carrier of the palanquin, the body is the carrier. So Jad Bharat is saying, I'm not even carrying this palanquin, my body is. Certainly, as you have hinted, I have not labored carrying the palanquin, for I am detached from the body. So he's saying, it's like he's twisting. He's saying your sarcasm was actually true, but you don't know it. I'm actually not laboring at all. I'm just witnessing all of this as the spirit soul. He said, you have said that I am not stout and strong, and these words are befitting a person who does not know the distinction between the body and the soul. The body may be fat or thin, but no learned man would say such things of the spirit soul. As far as the spirit soul is concerned, I am neither fat nor skinny. Therefore, you are correct when you say that I am not very stout. Also, if the object of this journey and the path leading there were mine, there would be many troubles for me. But because they relate not to me, but to my body, there is no trouble at all. So don't be too worried about figuring that all out, because he's saying the same thing over and over. He's saying, your words were only directed to my mind and my body, but I have the understanding that that's not me. And so some things you said were correct, some things you said were incorrect. From this spiritual platform, I can see what was correct and what was incorrect. Even your sarcasm sometimes was correct. So this is Jad Bharat. Now, when the king hears this, he knows, okay, I'm not dealing with an ordinary dumb person. And the king wants to know more. So I encourage you to read further, and there's a few minutes left, and we'll stop here for any thoughts, comments. Anybody new or who hasn't spoken yet, I'll just check what I see unmuted suddenly and give you an opportunity if someone who hasn't spoken or shared anything would like to say something. Just wait a couple seconds for that, and then anybody, actually anybody can unmute at any time, and then I'll see who has already spoken and who hasn't. Well, nobody so far. So if anybody would like to say anything before we come to an end, feel free. So I'll end with one just final comment. Reading this story, this conversation between Jad Bharat and King Rahugana, try to see it in this way, that it's an interaction between spiritual consciousness and material consciousness. And we're in the position of the king, Rahugana, who somehow we've been benefited to understand that such a thing exists as spiritual. I remember when I first heard Srila Prabhupada words, I had one lecture and I kept playing it over and over again. And I was realizing there is something here. I don't know how to talk about it or what it is, but there are truths here that are so much beyond me and that are so attractive that I want to know and I want to understand this. And so I just became addicted to hearing Prabhupada. I had a job where I was driving around. It required a lot of driving around, and I would just play all of the lectures by Prabhupada, all of the conversations, all of the presentations that he gave. And I just somehow knew that by hearing in this way, something new is entering in. And I just want to be open to that. Just receive it gratefully. So we have to be very patient and hear for a long time. And we will be changed by that if we're hearing with gratitude and with a service attitude. And not trying to, we don't know this, but we do this. We try to become superior to what's being spoken by hearing it in my own way for my own purposes, or speculating on it or trying this or that. That's a necessary stage. But there also comes a stage where one realizes that process is somewhat hopeless. It just remains intellectual. The real thing to do is to humbly hear and serve these words. Once we've been able to recognize pure sound vibration, if you do that, then that truth will enter into your heart and you'll see it as truth. And you can start to live from it as truth. So that's the way to hear the Bhagavatam. So any final thoughts, comments, questions?
Ghanashyam, I've never heard before how you just phrased it, just taking in the sound vibration, because I appreciate the point of intellectualizing versus realizing. Very clear on that. But are you saying just kind of listen intently, listen humbly and submissively, and kind of just let those words wash over you? Is that what you mean by listening to the sound vibration?
Exactly. I mean, when we hear in the right way, it's not a point that we store in our mind, but it's a point that we own because it's awakened. You remember in the very beginning of this section, it says that King Rahugana awakened to his real knowledge. So the knowledge of the Bhagavatam is already inside of us, but it's covered. So the mind has to do what it does. It has to try to figure things out and understand. I'm not saying stop all that, but there's also a way in which hearing in the right consciousness, with the right receptivity, then it awakens that truth that's being spoken about in a book. It awakens it within me, and then it's mine. And then I can live from it and not just try to use it from the intellectual vehicle. Our intelligence right now is controlled by Maya. Our minds are controlled by Maya. And so we grapple with it and we figure out, and I'm not saying stop that, it's necessary, we want to understand things, but there's another way of hearing. There's another way of hearing, which is preparing the consciousness for a pure sound vibration and being changed by that sound vibration. Because one realizes from within the truth that's being spoken without. You know, it's being spoken outside of us only because we've forgotten it from within. That's why it has to be outside of us at first. There has to be a scripture. There has to be another person who delivers it because it's covered in our own hearts. But if we understand what does it mean to uncover it, what can I do about uncovering it? Then you're starting to prepare your consciousness so that when you hear it outside of you, it awakens within. And then spiritual life changes. And you start to see this is all true. The power of the holy name is true. The power of just hearing to give perfection is true. It's not intellectual, but we may have to use that for some time. I think I should stop. I'm sorry, I went a little bit over. But I want to thank all of you.
Thank you for the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining. It's a blessing that we can join together and associate despite the circumstances. And I hope you received something from this discussion. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Jai.
Haribol,
Srila Prabhupada
thank you.
ki jai.
Jai.
Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.
Thank you so much, Ghanashyam Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhus. You go. Nice to see all of you.